You'll see decade after decade similar reports from security personnel guarding the missiles or missile maintenance personnel who had to bring up the missiles that were knocked offline, or the actual launch officers. So virtually every nuclear missile base from the early 60s on, and again, I stopped researching in 2010, but it just occurred again and again and again all over the country at these missile bases.
Keep watching to learn more.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is UFOs and nuclear weapons. And my guest is Robert Hastings, author of the classic book UFOs and Nukes, Extraordinary Encounters at Nuclear Weapons Sites. Originally published in 2008, second edition published in 2017. It is a landmark book for anybody interested in UFOs. Subsequently, Robert Hastings co-authored a book with his colleague, Bob Jacobs, called Confession, Our Hidden Alien Encounters Revealed. Robert Hastings is in Colorado, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Robert. It is a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you for having me.
You've been intensely looking at a very narrow but very important issue for many decades now, the relationship between unidentified aerial objects or aerial phenomena, whatever label is currently popular, and nuclear weapons of all things. And it's extraordinary when you consider that in our lifetime, humanity now has the capability for the first time of literally destroying itself. We have never in human history had such power, and at the same time, it seems as if we're being confronted by a mystery that defies science.
I would agree with all of that. I sort of fell into this field or this particular area of interest as a teenager. My father was career Air Force, and in 1967, he and our family were at Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana, which was then and is to this day a Minuteman nuclear missile base. I was a junior in high school, but 3 nights a week after high school, I worked at the base air traffic control tower as a janitor. And over the course of many months, I made the acquaintance of a man named Bob Grasser, who was an FAA supervisor, who in the course of his work breaks in the break room would answer my many questions about radar theory and so forth. He was very gracious. And so we had something of a minimal but real relationship. And one night I was walking through where he worked, called RAPCON, Radar Approach Control, and he just, as I passed his station and was emptying his trash can, he motioned me over, and I can't remember after all these years the exact words, but he basically pointed out 5 unknown targets as they're known, and said something to the effect that I thought they were UFOs. That's what I was led to believe, I thought. And I think I got excited and began peppering him with questions, and his demeanor kind of was taken aback. His whole body language was, uh-oh. So he asked me to come and clean the RAPCON Center later, and so I cleaned the rest of the facility, the air traffic control tower, and then came back at the end of my shift and tried to reapproach him on this, and he clearly didn't want to talk about it. But my father worked at a facility on Malmstrom called the SAGE building, SAGE, all caps, which was the NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command Center for radar. And long story short, when I told him what happened at the tower that night, unbeknownst to me, he made inquiries at work, and a few days later said they were tracking those targets at at SAGE. And he said they were considered to be bona fide UFOs, and the rumor was that they were maneuvering near nuclear missile sites. So that series of improbable circumstances is what kicked off my whole research career.
And I gather that over the years you have interviewed well over 100 firsthand witnesses to similar events.
My total now that I consider sources, credible sources, is 167 military veterans, primarily Air Force, but a few Army and Navy guys. I've also interviewed civilian technicians who worked at the nuclear labs, Sandia and Los Alamos, and they've all provided information that has led me to conclude that indeed nuclear weapons in this country in particular are of interest to whoever are flying what we call UFOs. And spent nearly 4 decades, over 4 decades actually, interviewing those persons. I'm retired now, more or less, but the body of data that I have and have presented in my book, I think speaks for itself.
I understand that it's not a situation strictly limited to the United States. It's been reported, for example, that in the Soviet Union back then there was a case that has received publicity in which UFOs actually triggered a launch sequence on nuclear missiles.
That's correct. I have focused primarily on the United States, almost exclusively, in fact. But journalist George Knapp in 1993 or 4, somewhere in that neighborhood, did go to Russia and met with a number of former Soviet Army personnel to discuss the subject of UFOs in the Soviet Union and the military's knowledge. And there was a colonel whose name is escaping me, who showed him documents, actually helped him smuggle documents out of Russia, is what it comes down to. And one of the documents related to an incident in Soviet Ukraine in October of 1982, where a large disc-shaped object hovered at low altitude above this intermediate range ballistic missile base. Those missiles would have been targeted on Western Europe, not the United States. But in any case, my understanding is that ground troops there fired an anti-aircraft missile at this object. And whether or not that precipitated what happened next, according to the document, suddenly the nuclear missiles that the launch officers had control of suddenly went into countdown mode. They were preparing to launch to all appearances. And for about 15 seconds, this was a terrifying situation. These individuals down in the launch capsule didn't know if World War III was about to begin. If these missiles had been launched and, headed toward Western Europe, it could indeed have been the beginning of a massive nuclear conflict. In any case, according to the document that George Knapp smuggled back to the States, after 15 seconds, this anomaly ceased. Everything returned to normal. In the past decade or so, journalists in Russia have interviewed persons who were actually involved in that incident, a number of former military personnel, Soviet Army personnel, and they've confirmed everything that appeared in the document. They've said, they were utterly terrified, and it did involve, all of that did occur when this huge, mysterious disc-shaped object hovered above the missile base.
And there's a very similar case, I understand, that took place at the Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota, I believe, where the launch sequence again was triggered by apparent UFO activity.
That's correct. In 2007, I interviewed a former Air Force, I believe he was retired Air Force missile launch officer named Captain David Schur. The last name is spelled Schur. And I tape record my interviews with the veterans. And so what appears in my book is the verbatim testimony that he gave me during this interview. What he said was, he was at a place called Echo Flight. It was a group of 10 Minuteman nuclear missiles designated Echo. He was in the underground launch capsule when suddenly he got a call from his security guard, one of them at ground level, saying that this fully luminous disc-shaped object was maneuvering above one of the missile sites. And no sooner had he gotten that message down on his launch console in the capsule, that missile's light lit up, what's called launch in progress light. And to all intents and purposes, it appeared that missile was launching. Captain Schur flipped what's called an inhibit switch and stopped that progression to countdown. No sooner had he done that, however, he said that the guard was apprising him of ongoing events at ground level, and various guards out in the field among his flight of 10 missiles were reporting the object moving from missile to missile. And so he couldn't remember the exact designations of the missiles, but let's say E6, Echo 6. When the guard said it's now above Echo 6, suddenly on his console, Echo 6 went into launch in progress mode. And that apparently went on. He thinks that 7 or 8 of his missiles were impacted in that manner. And then finally, everything returned to normal. Now, there's something called the primary alert system, which is a communication system among all the capsules at Minot, 15 capsules at that time, controlling 150 missiles. And he was hearing, as all of this was going on, that this object, this luminous aerial object, had proceeded to virtually every flight, these 15 flights, and he could not recall in 2007 when he gave the interview whether other people had launch in progress indicators, but he knows that their guards were reporting the missile, or the UFO rather, in the vicinity of their missiles too. So extremely dramatic incident, probably the most dramatic I've heard about.
And when did this occur?
He believes it was 1966, perhaps 67. And again, he gave the interview in 2007, so that was the best he could do. I tried to prompt him as to whether he could relate it to other events that had gone on in his life to try to pin down the time frame, but he said he couldn't.
Was this the same event that got the attention of Project Blue Book and Dr. Hynek around the time it originally occurred?
You're talking about in August of 1966. Dr. Hynek did release actually how it escaped classification. I can't imagine, but he wrote, Dr. Hynek, who of course was Blue Book's scientific advisor, in one of the issues in December of 1966 of the Saturday Evening Post magazine. He wrote an extensive article about UFO activity at Minot Air Force Base, and even cited one of these field reports about the object hovering above this group of missiles. Now, I can't remember off the top of my head what the flight that was involved, or the time of day. And I vaguely recall that incident that Hynek reported on was a daylight incident, but I could be mistaken. I do know Captain Schur told me what he was involved in occurred at night. There's another former launch officer who was at Minot during the same time frame. His name's Larry Manross, former captain, and he has confirmed that the same thing happened in his capsule. But because neither Schur nor Manross could remember the exact dates, we couldn't really correlate whether that was the same event or two different events.
Considering that you've interviewed now 160 people, I'm going to assume that most of them are reporting similar incidents. So this type of phenomenon seems to be quite prevalent.
Captain Robert Salas, who was at Malmstrom Air Force Base the same time that my dad was, Captain Robert Salas, he's been public very, very vociferously for, 25 years. He's talked about what happened to him. In his case, and I've determined through my research, it was the evening of March 24th, 1967. He suddenly was in the same situation. He's in the launch capsule. His commander, a man named, I think he was a captain at the time, Frederick Mywald, was taking his rest break. So Salas was alone at the console, and suddenly he got a call from one of his guards, probably what's called the flight security controller, the head security person, saying that, sir, there's multiple strange objects zipping around the sky and performing very odd maneuvers. And Salas didn't know what to make of that, and he even recalls being sort of skeptical, saying, you mean UFOs? And in any event, he didn't view it as an immediate threat, and he told the guard to call back if anything else happened. Well, according to Salas, 5 minutes later, the same gentleman called back and screamed into the phone. It's right above the front gate at the what's called the launch control facility. And he said, the guard said that all the guards were armed and had their weapons brandished their weapons and were approaching this object as it hovered over the gate. And, Salas said, I thought we were under attack. I had no idea, this was a Soviet secret weapon, could not make sense of what I was being told. But he didn't have time to really contemplate it much because at that moment, his 10 missiles began dropping offline, going inactive. They could not have been launched. So primarily, essentially the exact opposite of what Captain Shore told me. Salas's missiles were deactivated as opposed to activated. So Salas screamed for Captain Mywald, to wake up and assist him. And so they had to deal with that. They did get a report from the field of a bright object hovering over one of the missile silos, which are scattered around the countryside. They're controlled by this central launch control facility. But some miles away, the reports were this bright object was hovering over one of the actual missile silos. Now, Salas kept silent. He was debriefed, as was Mywald, and was told this was secret. It was national security, not to discuss it with anyone, even each other. And he kept his silence until, I think, 1994 or 5. So very dramatic things have been going on at America's nuclear missile sites.
Well, of the people you interviewed, how many of them have reported, or what percentage of them have reported similar kinds of incidents?
I don't know that I could quantify them in terms of a percentage, but multiple reports of that nature occurring from the early 60s through 2010 and at various bases at the time. Even prior to Malmstrom and Minot in the mid-60s, a couple of years earlier at Walker Air Force Base in Roswell, New Mexico, believe it or not, there was an Atlas missile base, and I've interviewed 6 individuals who were launch officers down there, and they independently described to me similar incidents where these luminous objects hovered directly above their missile sites. Now, this would have been the 63, 64 time frame. To their knowledge, they did not ever hear about or know directly about any interruptions of the missile's functionality in any manner, but the guards were on multiple occasions reporting these objects hovering over the missiles. This went on, if one reads my book, UFOs and Nukes, you'll see decade after decade similar reports from security personnel guarding the missiles or missile maintenance personnel who had to bring up the missiles that were knocked offline, or the actual launch officers. So virtually every nuclear missile base from the early 60s on, and again, I stopped researching in 2010, but it just occurred again and again and again all over the country at these missile bases.
Well, it certainly suggests that there's an intelligence behind these objects and that it is purposefully looking at our nuclear weapon systems.
That's correct. And the persons who were, eyewitnesses, the security personnel who were at ground level, not in the underground launch capsule, but the people who were up at ground level who saw from case to case, actually saw the objects in the air, they all described them as luminous or metallic appearing, disc-shaped, sometimes spherical, performing maneuvers that no aircraft could probably do even in 2025, let alone in the 1960s. And when I would ask their opinion during interviews, so what do you think was that? What was that? Virtually all of them said, couldn't have been from Earth. It was technology vastly beyond anything we had at the time. And in my opinion, that's still the case today. So I think we do have a third party who has not only expressed interest but tampered with weapons here in America and again in Russia. I would not be surprised if every nuclear power on Earth has had this problem, and it's just not come to light yet. But, and the level of sophistication, the technology involved clearly indicated orders of magnitude beyond human technology. So what are the inferences? In my opinion, we're dealing with either ETs or interdimensionals or something not quite human.
The interesting thing to me, Robert, is that but for your efforts, we might not know about this at all. Because of government secrecy, and it's understandable why governments would want to keep events like this secret. But I find it fascinating that in the last 4 years or so, you've come out and indicated that in addition to the intense research that you've done over many decades, that you've also had some type of contact yourself with non-human intelligence.
That's my assessment. And, I wish to God it had never happened. I have no idea how it all works. I had an odd experience as a teenager that seemed to be a lucid memory, a very vivid memory of perhaps a childhood abduction experience. But this was prior to alien abductions being a common topic or even a known topic. I had never really heard about it until I read about the Betty and Barney Hill story in Look magazine in 1966. I distinctly remember reading that and finding it fascinating. But 2 years prior to that, I had a series of what I consider to be flashbacks of what probably was a childhood abduction. But then, to my conscious recollection, nothing occurred until August of 1988. I lived in Albuquerque. I went on a camping trip with some people, and it's almost hard to describe even after all these years, but we were camping in the mountains near Albuquerque. One of the campers awoke us all screaming at the top of her voice, "What are those lights? What are those lights?" And some of us kind of sleepily stumbled out of the tent. There were multiple tents. And all I saw was an unlit, a dark object in between two strobe lights moving away in the sky. No noise was detectable. And because of my mental state at the time, and I think this was an induced state, I just blew it off. I just went, that's nothing. Well, clearly it was something, but something was telling me in my own mind that it was nothing to worry about. However, shortly thereafter, I woke up with blood on my pillow. And shortly after that, one of the other campers called me up and said, you need to come over this weekend and talk to me about what happened this past weekend. She said one of the other campers was having repetitive nightmares every night since the camping trip. In the nightmare, the woman who was calling me on the phone and I and her 8-year-old daughter, in these nightmares this other woman kept having, we were seen walking single file toward a lit glowing object on the ground in the campsite. And there's lots of other details that are quite lengthy to get into, but within 2 weeks, I suddenly had this very bizarre realization that even though I had spent years and years investigating the military aspects of the UFO phenomenon, I was aware of the abduction accounts, but I never in a million years thought I would be a target, so to speak. But I suddenly had to confront the possibility. And for whatever reason, over the next 20 years, I had 6 or 7 other experiences that I can only characterize as abductions. So again, I don't know how it all works, which came first. Was I already on someone's radar as a child and maybe even subliminally influenced to do my research the way I was obsessed with doing that. I couldn't really explain why I needed to investigate it, and more importantly, or equally importantly, present it to the public. In 1981, I went on the college lecture circuit and gave over 500 lectures at colleges and universities between 1981 and 2016, I believe, 17. Now, so, I'm still trying to sort it out at the age of 75. Was I influenced to do what I did? Was my research my own idea? Don't have the answers, but I do consider myself an experiencer. It's complicated my research, tremendously. A lot of people just can't grapple with the idea of alien abductions, and so I'm sure some of the people who would listen to me seriously, take me seriously when I talk about the military cases. As soon as I talk about being an abductee, I lose them, and I'm sure that some number of people have walked away from what I have to say because of that fact. But it's real. It's ongoing. It's over now, seemingly, but it was ongoing for decades.
In your view, the nuts and bolts physical craft that we're seeing hovering over nuclear missile sites and the abductions are related. These are not totally independent events.
I think that's correct. And I suspect, I can't prove, of course, and I don't even know, but I think the entities that have been shutting down the missiles are the same entities that I've encountered. Now, I have conscious memories from this handful of experiences that I've had. I've also undergone time regression hypnosis to try to pry loose further memories to try to understand what took place. But that aside, I have conscious memories of encountering during this handful of incidents over the years what we typically now call grays, non-human intelligences that are the ones that I've met are about 4.5 feet tall, large, bald, bulbous heads, and big black eyes. And I can tell you whether it's, take it or leave it, but I have had what seemed to be genuine telepathic communication with them. One-way communication primarily, as far as I can remember. They're telling me things. So it's crazy. I understand it. It sounds, quite beyond the pale. It's not part of the current paradigm that humans are considered everyday reality. But if you look at the literature on the abduction phenomenon, you're going to find lots of credible, level-headed people all over the world reporting the same kinds of things that I am. So in my view, it's real, it's physical, it's going on, and it's part of the overall picture.
Well, these telepathic communications, were there any messages there that were intended for you to share with other people?
No, not that I recall. They were basically instructions as to what was about to happen and what they were going to do with me. In previous podcasts, I've described one incident in particular that sort of brings together several elements of these encounters. In early 1995, it was one of the winter months, but I don't know the exact even month. I was in a hotel room in Pittsburgh. I had given a lecture the previous day at a school in western Pennsylvania. I was staying in this hotel overnight and planning to fly out the next day to come back home in New Mexico, where I lived at the time. And sometime during the dark hours, I suddenly awoke with a start and got one of these messages in my mind. And if one has never had one of these, it's kind of hard to describe. It's very hard to describe what it's like, but it's clear it's not your imagination, it's real. And what I heard in my head was, "We are here for you. You have met us before." And in response to that, because I had had prior experiences, I gasped out loud, "They're here." And I was terrified. No sooner had I said that, I literally levitated off the bed. I was airborne. My body was prone, but I was heading up toward the ceiling, this very high ceiling. Now, in any experience that I've had with these entities prior to that night and following that night, I have no memory, zero memory of levitating. But that night I did. I was awake. I was not dreaming. I was not hallucinating. I was not experiencing sleep paralysis. In the few moments that I was awake before that all happened, I looked around the darkened room. I could see kitchenette. I could see a small round table with 4 chairs and my winter coat draped over one of them. I was looking at physical features in my environment. So I was not dreaming, and suddenly I was airborne and heading up to the ceiling. And that lasted perhaps 5 or 6 seconds, and then apparently I was rendered unconscious because the next moment sunlight was flooding through the windows. It was hours later, and I was just laying on the bed, diagonally across the bed on top of the covers, just trying to process it all and going, oh my God. And so the inference, of course, is that I was taken through the ceiling. And if one looks at the literature on the abduction phenomenon, people all over the world are reporting that these entities take you through walls, through closed windows. Seemingly, I went through the ceiling. And how they do that is anyone's guess. Rudy Shield, Dr. Rudy Shield of Harvard, has speculated that it's a quantum phenomenon. Somehow they do have the ability to move physical objects through other physical objects. Who knows how it was done, but seemingly I was moved through the ceiling. But after I awoke the following morning, and I'm laying there just shocked and trying to process it all, I finally got up to go to the bathroom. I flipped the light switch in the bathroom, no response. There had been a power failure in the hotel overnight. Now, many of your viewers are aware probably that in case of many, many sightings of UFOs worldwide over decades, power blackouts are often associated with the presence of these objects for whatever reason. So I finally got it together to go outside. I was getting hungry. I went to the parking lot. There was a fire engine in the parking lot, and the fireman was leaning against it smoking a cigarette. And I walked up to him and said, is there a fire in the hotel? I didn't hear an alarm. And he was real puzzled. His voice was very puzzled. And he's waving his cigarette around as he's talking to me. And he said, nah. And he pointed toward my hotel. And he said, that hotel and the one next to it had a power failure overnight. And then he turned around and pointed across the street and said, all those restaurants on the other side of the street are on the same grid and they're just fine. So we're trying to figure out why these 2 hotels had this power failure. Well, I was rolling my eyes by that point. I was pretty sure I knew why there was a power failure, but I wasn't going to obviously tell this guy anything. So, that is one of the more remarkable events that has happened to me in the course of this unfolding situation.
Bob Jacobs, who is your co-author, a person who had a similar interest as you have about UFOs and nuclear weapons, who also describes himself as having had similar abduction-type experiences.
Correct. I introduced myself by phone with Bob in 1986. Over the years, I interviewed him at length multiple times about the incident he was involved in. It's called the Big Sur UFO incident. Long story, but in 1964, he was in the Air Force. He headed up, a telescopic camera team in California, affiliated with Vandenberg Air Force Base. And his job was to photograph missile launches. And as many of your viewers will probably know, he and his team inadvertently captured a UFO on film circling this dummy warhead that was flying out over the Pacific. And on the film, there were 4 flashes of light directed from the UFO to the warhead, whereupon it began tumbling and fell into the Pacific Ocean. Now, as an aside here, in the last 2 years, Lou Elizondo, former head of ATIP, has said publicly in multiple interviews that he, while with ATIP, saw that film. He was given a copy of my book by Dr. Hal Puthoff in 2008 and apparently learned about Big Sur from reading my book. And in any case, he said that he did ask access to the Big Sur film presumably from CIA, because that's who confiscated it in 1964. And he, as of 2 years ago, is now on record as saying he saw the film. He said it shows exactly what Dr. Bob Jacobs said it showed, a UFO, in effect, shooting down a dummy nuclear warhead in flight. Now, again, I met Bob in '86, and I knew him for all these years. In 2012, he graciously offered his media studio at Bradley University to allow me to film on video, on camera, a number of the veterans that I'd interviewed years earlier. And so I was with him in May of 2012 for, I think, a 2, maybe 3-day period. And we were just doing these interviews. At the end of the last day, I took the veterans that we interviewed back to the airport, got them on their planes to go back home, went back to the university, went into Bob's office, sat down, closed the door, actually sat down and said, I've known you for many years. I've got to tell you something I've never told you. And I told him about my abduction experiences. Much to my amazement, Bob's response was, I've had them too. And he described a number of incidents that he had seemingly involving face-to-face encounters with non-human entities. Actually, of the 167 veterans that I consider my primary sources, 7 of them have reported having abduction experiences, Bob being one of them. So that was in 2012. We talked about it, of course, on and off over the years. In 2018, he said to me, neither of us are getting any younger. If we're going to be true to ourselves and try to tell the public about the reality of all of this, we really should go public and talk about our abduction experiences. So we wrote this book, Confession, and we don't have, God knows, we don't have the answers as to what it's all about, but we just tried as accurately as possible to describe what we recall having happened to us.
What would you say is your best speculation at this point regarding the overall situation?
Big picture, in my humble opinion, we have multiple races from different points, other worlds who have an understanding of physics and the technology based on that physics. They can get from their worlds to our world, no problem, back and forth. Whether they're utilizing what we would call interdimensional space, to take shortcuts through the universe to get here, who knows? But I think based on the collective abduction reports over the years, several different species seem to be involved in these abductions. It's not one group of entities. So in my view, we have multiple races, obviously advanced to humanity in terms of technology, in terms of mental abilities, the ability to engage in telepathic communication. And I think the fact that they've probably been here for a long, long time, perhaps thousands of years. But it is a matter of record that statistically, after World War II, when nuclear weapons were invented and used, there was an uptick in sightings worldwide of UFO activity. I think it's no coincidence that that's the case. And I do think that the nuclear weapons aspect of all of this is integral to what's going on.
It would seem to me, just based on the discussion that we've had so far, that they are deliberately demonstrating that they have the power to stop launches, or the power to cause launches, or the power to shoot these objects down, or the power to hover right over our Air Force bases and we can do nothing about it, and that they want us to know that.
All of the above. That's my view. I think that these provocative incidents are essentially demonstrations of their technical prowess, and I think by inference, their intentions. I think they're trying to scare the hell out of the nuclear powers. When the missiles were temporarily activated at Minot in North Dakota and in the Soviet Union, I don't think they were attempting to start World War III. They either shut down the unauthorized launch sequence themselves in Russia, or they knew that the launch officers in the U.S. at Minot Air Force Base could shut down what they had put into had initiated the launch sequence. So I think they're just trying to make a point. They're wagging a finger at us. But I've also said, and I've told my lecture audiences when I was speaking around the country over the decades, if they do have a long-term presence here, if they have bases, for example, under the ocean, if they have projects and plans that involve the earthly realm, a massive nuclear conflict would disrupt what they've got going on, in addition to whatever detrimental effects it would have, catastrophic effects it would have on human civilization. So perhaps what they're doing is partially altruistic toward the human race, but probably self-serving as well in that regard.
What about your own situation? Do you feel that they may have in any way prompted you to take such a passionate interest in this topic?
As I said in this book I wrote with Bob Jacobs, because of this childhood, I didn't go into great detail about it, but this incident that I had as a child and memories of it later in my childhood, I'm pretty sure that they have been a part of my life for most of my life. And who knows why I didn't have any sense of their presence and after that childhood era until I was 38 in 1988. Why the gap? Who knows? If they interacted with me in that interval, I have no memory of it. But as I said in the book, because these incidents were ongoing and because I really could not explain, I can't still to this day explain why I have been so driven, not only to research this, to investigate it, but I've had, not so much now because I'm not well and I don't do it anymore, but for decades I had the need to communicate this to the public. And I'm an introvert by nature. Speaking in front of lecture audiences was just something that was very difficult, but I felt it had to be done. There weren't too many people who had the information I had, and I felt it incumbent upon me to talk publicly about what I had learned from these military veterans. So essentially, almost without exaggeration, my whole life for decades has revolved around this. And so perhaps naturally, I have wondered over the years, is this my own idea? Was this my own game plan, or was I really being subliminally, subconsciously prompted by these entities that I am quite clear I've had contact with? Were they in effect pushing me, nudging me down the road? I have no idea, but I don't think that's an unreasonable thought, or at least something to speculate about. So, I don't think at this late in the game I'm going to have any answers to that, but yeah, I've given that serious thought.
7 of the 160 individuals that you've interviewed also reported this type of contact or abduction experience. It certainly suggests that it's not just an accidental or random event that's taking place, that it's part of a systematic effort to interact with humanity at some level.
I think that's correct. And, I can't quantify this in terms of the general population, but even among the 167 veterans that I've interviewed, 7 may not seem like a significant number, but you've got 7 people who had experiences. They were either charged with operating or guarding nuclear weapons, and at other points in their lives, they had face-to-face alien abduction experiences. Some of your viewers may not know this. Bob Salas, who was involved in this missile shutdown at Malmstrom in March of '67, he kept his secret. I knew about it because we were friends. I knew about it for many years. But finally, in 2013, he went public and said that in 1985, he clearly had an abduction experience. And in my book, I have a chapter called Veteran Voices, where I describe some of the veterans who've talked to me about their apparent abduction experiences, go on the record and talk about what happened to them. So, again, most people know, the great majority of people know about what Bob has talked about at Malmstrom Air Force Base, but virtually no one knows what happened at his home in California 2 decades later. Let me cite one other individual who I consider utterly credible. A man named Mario Woods introduced himself to me in 2017, In 1977, he was a security policeman at Ellsworth Air Force Base, and he guarded what was called November Flight, a group of 10 missiles designated November. And long story short, there was alarms at one of the missiles one night in November. He can't remember what day in November. He remembers it was around Thanksgiving. He's at this launch control facility with the other security policemen, and suddenly there's alarms going off because this one missile was clearly having anomalies. Something had tripped the wires, so to speak, and there was an unauthorized presence at one of these missile sites. So Mario Woods and his partner raced out there, gathered their weapons and rushed out there. And as they approached this missile site, I forget the designation, I want to say November 5. In any case, they both saw suddenly this huge spherical shaped object. He said it was probably the size of a Walmart building, hovering just a few feet above the ground, above this missile silo. No sooner had that happened, suddenly it was as if all of the air was sucked out of the truck they were in. They suddenly were suffocating, they could not breathe. And no sooner had that happened, he saw out of his window small figures approaching the truck. And the next thing he knew, it was 4 hours later, and that they were at an entirely different location. They had no memory of themselves and their trucks being transported, but apparently they were transported about 5 miles away. And in 2017, I arranged to have some regression hypnosis on Mario, and if one looks at the video, I've never seen anybody as terrified in my life. He clearly was in the moment, reliving that encounter with these small entities. He was so scared, so terrified, he was trying to climb off the bed and hide while he was being regressed under hypnosis. And so he did remember encounter with non-human entities. And again, someone whose job was to guard nuclear missiles, and yet he's having that kind of encounter as well. So on occasion, they do overlap. The missile cases or the nuclear cases and the abduction cases, there is a Venn diagram overlap sometimes.
We seem to be in an era in which some form of disclosure is taking place. At one time, the government flatly denied that anything of any real scientific interest was occurring. Now we hear the possibility that maybe something is taking place, but they don't know what. I imagine that when events like this take place at a nuclear weapons facility, that the government has a process for debriefing the people involved, and that the government is well aware of what has taken place.
They're obviously aware, and virtually without exception, the people that I've interviewed who've had experiences out at the missile sites or other nuclear weapons-related facilities have described being debriefed by what are called OSI agents, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. And that goes on base after base, decade after decade. Those are the individuals that do the debriefing. In almost every case where they are debriefed, they're required to sign written non-disclosure statements stipulating severe penalties, legal penalties, and financial fines if they discuss what they've just described to the agents. And hence, these people wait 20 and 30 years to talk to me or go public on their own, as Bob Salas did and Bob Jacobs. They're concerned. Well, Jacobs wasn't debriefed by OSI, but virtually all the other people that I've interviewed said, they were so frightened at what essentially were threats about keeping your mouth shut that they waited decades to talk about this. So that does seem to be the pattern. I'm sure it's ongoing. I could mention this. People have asked me over the years, well, when you started researching or speaking publicly about your own work, were you threatened at all? Well, what happened to me was my first series of lectures was in the fall of 1981. I had, I believe, 16 dates at various colleges and universities around the upper Midwest. And at various schools in the audience were military veterans. They had read in the local newspaper that I was going to be speaking about all of this, and they showed up to listen to what I had to say. And at many of those schools, someone would come up to me and say, I'm a veteran, I was at such and such a base, this is what I did, and I know what you're talking about because the same thing happened to me, or something similar. When that happened, I would ask all these individuals if they would be willing to sit for a formal interview at some point when I got off the road. Some said yes, some said no. But in February of 1982, I began a series of follow-up calls with, I think it was 7 or 8 of these individuals. And I would talk to them over the phone and, with their permission, record what they were telling me. After each one of those calls, I would hang up the phone, thank them for speaking with me, hang up the phone. Within a minute or two, I would get another call, pick up the phone, and no one was saying anything. All I heard was heavy breathing. And after about 30 seconds or a minute, they would hang up. And so the first time that happened, I went, okay, I'm on someone's radar, and I got frightened, frankly. I didn't know, what was going to happen next. I was clearly pushing the envelope by discussing publicly classified information. Someone was not happy about that. I had gotten some national publicity through the United Press International Wire Service, which hundreds of newspapers around the country picked up this story about me talking about UFOs and a government cover-up, and apparently I came to someone's attention. And so I sort of, paused, and before I made the second call to the veteran, but I felt I was either going to do this or I wasn't, and I sort of just found the courage somewhere to keep at it, talk to these other individuals. But after every one of these calls, I had the same effect, same consequence, where someone would call up. It was usually within 5 minutes. I think I recall once or twice it was about an hour later, I got the same heavy breathing, no one talking into the phone call. So that's the kind of problems I've dealt with. Now, I know that I have an FBI file on me. In 2011, another researcher, he filed an FOI request on my behalf with the FBI to see if they had files on me. The letter that he got and subsequently forwarded to me, which I have, the FBI admitted that their master index showed that they did have files on me, and they claim when they looked for them, they were missing. They further said there were other files at their headquarters in Washington, but they were undergoing transferring written files to digital files, and they couldn't immediately provide them to me. So I know the FBI has files on me. I made similar inquiries with CIA and the National Security Agency. In those two cases, I got we can neither confirm nor deny responses. So I know my work has come to someone's attention, and they're probably, even now that I'm not really researching much anymore, they're probably still keeping an eye on me. In fact, Jeff, as you may recall, we seemed to have some communications issue earlier this year when you asked me to confirm this date to speak with you, and I sent you a response. You did not get that response. Now, over the years, I have found when I'm speaking with sources, that is, ex-military person, other researchers, or journalists, I think what you're doing essentially is journalistic in this sense. I have these email problems. I have telephone problems. When I talk to those three categories of persons, more often than not, or at least as often as not, the phone calls get interrupted in midstream, and I have to call them back. They call me back. And then there's an ongoing email issue. So somebody's, it's low-level harassment. I think I know who's behind it, but I can't prove it. And I just view it. It comes with the territory. I don't lose any sleep over it.
It doesn't stop you, which is important. But let me ask you one final question, Robert. I know you've had health problems in recent years, and I understand you stopped doing the college lecture circuit, but you did decide, I gather, to continue your public activities. And I wonder if there's anything behind that motive at this stage in your life.
I think I mentioned earlier, the last case that I investigated occurred in October 2010. at F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming. There was a large-scale incident where 5 of these missile alert facilities, they're now called, the Air Force changed their name. They're no longer launch control facilities. They're now missile alert facilities. Anyway, in October 23rd of 2010, the Atlantic website had a dramatic story based on leaked information that 5 of these MAFs, missile alert facilities, suddenly cannot communicate with F.E. Warren Air Force Base, meaning that if, God forbid, there had been an order to launch their missiles at that time, they could not have gotten their order through normal channels. It was subsequently learned that there was a backup airborne system that would have allowed them to launch their missiles if ordered to do so. But it was a major incident and a snafu. And as soon as I heard about that, I went, this probably is UFO related. And I spoke with an individual, I'm not going to identify him, who had contacts at F.E. Warren Air Force Base. And on my behalf, he approached these persons, and they were actually, these 2 missile maintenance technicians were out in the field addressing this communication issue, and both of them reported seeing what was described as a huge cigar-shaped object flying in the sky above the missile field when these technical issues were cropping up. So, as I suspected, there seemed to be a UFO link with all of that. But to do all of that and to do it properly requires a sort of a mental clarity that I don't think I have anymore, and a physical energy that I don't have anymore. So after 2010, I more or less said, I'm a spectator from here on out. So that's how I would describe myself at this point.
But you feel comfortable sharing the earlier work that you did for so many years.
Absolutely. Again, I have this driving sense that the public needs to know about this. This is real. I think the U.S. government does not have the right to keep us in the dark decade after decade about something as dramatic as UFOs shutting down or activating our nuclear weapons. And, I don't expect to see in my lifetime the big announcement from some president saying, all of this is true. They are from somewhere else. They've been here a long time. They've been interacting with us. And we've kept this all secret for years for your own good, American public. And I don't think I'm going to live to see that. But there's been so many amazing things that have happened in the last 5, 6, 7 years. ATIP coming out, Lou Elizondo in particular. He's confirmed in at least 2 interviews that I'm aware of in podcasts, he's confirmed that my work was right on. He said I gave information, I had information that ATIP used that they didn't have, and he's on camera saying all of that. So I feel that, belatedly, however long it took to occur, people are finally starting to pay attention to the nuclear weapons link.
Robert, from my point of view, you are a hero. You're doing an enormous public service. I don't know the price you may have paid for making that choice in your life, but I want to express on behalf of the New Thinking Aloud audience certainly a lot of gratitude for what you've done, and for the fact that in spite of being an abductee yourself, you've managed to maintain a level head, and you're very articulate about what you've experienced. I think that you are basically a credit to humanity. So thank you so much for being with me.
Well, I have to respond to that. I would just say I was a stubborn guy who needed some answers. And whether or not there was an unseen guidance in what I did, again, that's up in the air. But, when we get right down to it, the heroes, the people that deserve our praise and our thanks, are the veterans who had the courage to speak to me and to come out, even after many of them were told, if you talk about this, you're going to be in deep trouble. Many of them waited decades, but they did finally come clean, and they're the ones that deserve the hero label, in my opinion.
I can't disagree with that at all, that you've been really the point of the spear, but there are a lot of people behind you carrying the spear as well.
I understand. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with me. And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.